is The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. Put it together for the great Corey Brettschneider. So excited. Hello, sir. How are you?
Hi, Mark. Great to see you. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me as well. We're gonna fold our colleague John Rothman here in a second. It was sort of a spur of the moment thing because we were talking already about the Constitution, presidents. He'd mentioned FDR in the context of the Constitution and the stressing of the Constitution, even as FDR is celebrated. Anyway, I'm going to bring him on in a moment. But can you handle that last question? What was it? It was related to, where is it? Did we get rid of it already? It was from Rich. And there it is. Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the authority to change the size of the Supreme Court. This is about expanding the court. You know, what could be called packing the court. Congress has used that authority 7 times before. This often comes up. The Supreme Court, now so one-sided with decisions that don't really reflect, it would seem, the flavor of American society today. Alt-right radical judges now having taken control of the Supreme Court. What's involved and how realistic is it to expand that court?
Well, it's absolutely right that the number of 9, which is the current number, of course, is not set by the Constitution, that it's statutory. So there could be a change in the law passed by Congress. And then you still, of course, would have to get the new justices or the additional justices through the process of confirmation. But it is possible. I mean, it sounds like you might have been talking about this before, but the idea of explicitly packing the court is usually a reference to something that FDR considered. And when you see what the stakes that FDR was against, you understand why he was considering it. The Supreme Court was really striking down the most basic parts of the New Deal to do, for instance, with things like minimum wage and maximum hours and regulation of labor. In fact, the very right of the National Labor Relations Board to exist and to certify unions. So as the court was blocking all of this, he threatened it. Now, he didn't come through and actually do it, but that was enough. It led in part, and there's debate about what it was specifically, but one factor certainly, I think, was this threat to pack. But it also was his really increasing political power that the court backed down. And so it really went from blocking the New Deal through its idea of limited government power, limited power in particular of Congress, to allowing all sorts of pieces of legislation through. So even the threat worked without doing it. And it's why it's certainly on the table now as we start to think of this really horror show of opinions that has come through the court. And my book in particular came out the day after the court's immunity decision. So for a book about the dangers of executive power, and specifically it ends with the idea that we really never recovered from the criminal presidency of Richard Nixon, and that his ideas of a president being above the law are the legacy of that administration rather than a recovery. That case really is my argument on steroids. It's, because it's not just about immunity of sitting presidents, a dangerous idea, but immunity of even former presidents, at least when it comes to their most dangerous actions, those of official duty.
Again, Corey Brettschneider's book is The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. I want to put a button on this idea about the Supreme Court quickly, then I'll bring in Brother Rothman to join us in this conversation, because it was followed up, that question, in our chat by this. Sarah says, just want your opinion. Could Biden have expanded the Supreme Court before Dobbs? This was a question that was kicked around a lot as Biden took office, because we knew that there were some pretty onerous decisions coming down. Speak to the realities regarding what Biden could have done, threatened to do, et cetera.
Yeah, it's not a unilateral thing. He couldn't just add justices, but through legislation that he would sign, the court's number could be expanded. And then, of course, there's a nomination process, and there has to be confirmation from the Senate. So it would have been possible. And generally, I have to say, on this idea of Biden, in many ways, it was an important presidency. There was legislation, of course, that put a serious dent in childhood poverty. But when it comes to the issue that I'm most concerned with in the book of recovering the idea that no person, not even a president, is above the law, and the general idea of the rule of law applied equally, an idea we failed to see applied in the Nixon case, he didn't do enough to restore a constitutional order. And we see that not just in the immunity case, but also in the stripping of the right to an abortion in the Dobbs case. And I think there really wasn't enough attention to how dire things were with the Supreme Court. Now, he's done things, he's spoken out, but, that was
What
seen
would you have liked to have seen him do, Corey? What could he do?
well, one thing he could have done initially is revoke immediately the executive policy of the Department of Justice that says that no sitting president could be indicted. And he still could do that tomorrow. But I think there was a worry within that White House of not focusing on these issues, of not allowing I think all presidents really protect themselves and not wanting to allow, for instance, a unfounded prosecution of himself. And then in general, putting on the agenda, I've been talking for some time, and he was aware certainly of the danger of the court saying that sitting presidents were immune and that former presidents were immune, so that he could have been preemptive in the same way that your listener is talking about being preemptive in protecting the right to an abortion. The other thing he certainly could have done specifically on abortion is early on made a primary goal the national protection of the right to an abortion through legislation. And what would have happened if that would have been on the books is Dobbs wouldn't have mattered, because it would have been protected from statute. It's only because the only protection for the national right to an abortion was through the Supreme Court that the Dobbs opinion was so radical. So I think what I'm hearing from your listeners, I emphatically agree with, that there really had to be a role for the president in recovering our constitutional values in the face of a court that was assaulting them. And one thing I'm arguing in the book is, even though we didn't recover from Nixon, we've seen presidents in the past react to threats to democracy, threats to our basic rights, by seeing their presidencies as restorations of the democratic ideas of a constitution, of we the people. And did I see that with Biden? He's certainly no Trump, and I don't want to underestimate how important it was that he won that election. But we haven't done enough to shore up our democracy, and certainly those two areas that we've been talking about, abortion and the danger of a president above the law, are two of the big ones.
I want to bring in John Rothman, who is a professor of presidential history and a lecturer, former colleague at KGO. John, thank you. Chime in as necessary. I thought it was provocative what John had said. We kind of started our conversation with Corey with regard to your question, John, about FDR, or your comment about FDR, who had sort of is now lionized, of course, but you sort of noted that at the time he was doing things that were really contested. I mean, strongly contested. Wasn't that your point, John Rothman? Can John hear us or not?
Yes,
no.
I can hear you now. You came back. Okay. Corey, I'm going to order your book as soon as we're finished.
Thank you, John.
Absolutely right on, spot on. And of course, I mentioned FDR and the court packing attempt in 1937, legislation that was put before the Congress and which was defeated because the Democrats who objected and the conservative Republicans stopped it. But I'm looking forward to reading your book, particularly interested in your observation about Richard Nixon, his very famous statement in the David Frost interview that if a president does it, it's not against the law. And of course, that is horrific. And I can say that as somebody who worked for Richard Nixon.
Yeah, he, the way I argue it in the book is that sometimes that statement to Frost in the interview is sort of seen as a gotcha moment, that he sort of lost his cool and said this wild thing. And one thing I'm really trying to show in the book is that isn't the case at all in the interview, or if you look at his statements throughout his presidency, that he really believes that America is in a civil war with people like Daniel Ellsberg, who he calls the main ball when it comes to his enemies, and that, like Lincoln, actually, that he's got this extraordinary power to really commit any act. And his argument is that he's immune in doing so. And even so much so that he can make this crude statement that when a president does it, it's not illegal. Now, if you look at what the court's done, it's really vindicated that wild idea. But it was, like many of the presidents who I argue have threatened democracy, not a spur of the moment emotional thing. It was based in who's a lawyer and in an idea of the presidency. And part of what I tell too in the book is the idea that, far from being uncontested, that the grand jury at that moment did try to indict him. And we know now from the records that have been revealed that there was a vote actually to do so.
Unindicted co-conspirator.
Well, in U.S. versus Nixon, he's named an unindicted co-conspirator. But as you'll see, the argument, the story, more untold story that I tell in the book is that there was a grand jury, two of the grand jurors who I interviewed, who in a straw poll voted to indict the president of the United States, that they had seen the extent of his crimes. And Jaworski, the story that I tell, stopped the indictment. Now, how did he do it? First of all, he said he wouldn't agree. He wouldn't sign on. And he warned, too, that if they went forward, Elaine Edlund, for instance, a legal secretary, talks about how many of them raised two hands in their enthusiasm. And Vladimir Krgelj, the foreperson who brought the grand jury together, was insistent in a simple principle that if a president commits a crime, they should be indicted, former president or sitting president. And anyway, the story I tell in the book is that what Jaworski did is he said to them, look, if you do this, the president is going to surround the White House with military, and he's going to engage in a kind of self-coup to protect himself from the indictment. And he used that argument to say, please delay. And the continued story I tell is they basically essentially made a deal that the grand jury handed off the information to Congress and the roadmap with the hope that there would be impeachment proceedings. They agreed in court to pursue the case that you just mentioned, U.S. versus Nixon, to get the remaining tapes. But the main point was, after he stepped down, that there would be an indictment. So after not the full House, but the House of Representatives votes articles of impeachment, and after the tapes in U.S. versus Nixon are handed over, Krgelj comes back to Jaworski and says, okay, it's time to indict the sitting president. We made a deal. And rather than move forward, what Jaworski does, partly in discussion with Philip Lacavara, who I interviewed for the book, his deputy, is he goes, Lacavara thought just to suss out whether or not the pardon was coming, but it looks from the sequence that soon after he meets with Haig, that the pardon comes. So the point in the book is, unlike these arguments, I make the argument we faced a threat to democracy from Adams, and we recovered at the behest of recovery presidents like Jefferson and Madison, or Buchanan, that we recovered from Lincoln and Grant. With Nixon, we really never recovered, and the pardon is a huge, huge reason for that.
Can I ask you a quick question? I want your reflection on the Supreme Court decision relative to former presidents, and how you view Donald Trump in terms of the context if he goes back to the White House. What are the implications?
I mean, I think it is, some legal commentators have been talking about that there's hyperbole, saying that this places a president above the law. And they do what law professors often do. They say it's presumptive, the immunity, it's only official duties as opposed to unofficials. I hold a totally different view, which is that it really does place a president above the law. And if you think of that story I just told about Nixon surrounding the White House with military, that's official duty. Everything Nixon was arguing was official duty. And so that, to me, is not, in far from making me less worried, it makes me more worried. It takes the president's core powers when they're most dangerous and immunizes them from any prosecution. So what's the way that we could hold presidents accountable? I tell the story in the book of, at the founding, Patrick Henry saying, look, this Constitution's not going to work because the traditional checks on power, the judiciary, the impeachment power, are not going to stop. They might stop a sort of bad president, but they're not going to stop a criminal president. That's how he puts it. And we're really at that point of seeing that that's true.
I just want to interject what worried me, and I've pointed this out to people. If the Supreme Court decision that we now have had been applied to Richard Nixon, we never would have heard the tape of June 23rd, the smoking gun tape. Nixon and Haldeman would have gotten away with it. So I'm going to tell you, and I want everybody to know, I'm going to continue with you. I'm ordering your book. I can't wait to read it. It's purely fantastic, and I want to thank you for taking the time to write it, and I think it's very timely.
Thanks so much, John.
What's interesting to me, Corey, is, and it's oftentimes the case with us Americans. I'll just use myself as in this case. I'm sort of unaware of some of the specifics about what you had made a glancing reference to, which was sort of the beginnings of this nation and the early presidents and how they were involved in trying to reshape the government, if you will, and reshape the office of the presidency. You mentioned John Adams. You spent some time in the book talking about John Adams. Give me a second on that. These early guys who are involved with this new idea of the president of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the trust in the office that many of the framers had is they knew George Washington was going to be the first president. He was presiding over the Constitutional Convention, and he wasn't somebody that struck them as hell-bent on power or autocracy in any way. And in fact, he says in his second inaugural, the shortest ever given, 135 words, I just took the oath of office. It commits me to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. If I violate it, I want the people assembled to subject me to upbraidings, or if I really violate it, subject me to constitutional punishment. But when there's a transition to the second president, to John Adams, my argument is it's completely the opposite idea. And even Adams' self-understanding, he's McCullough and others praise him for being very learned. He is learned, but when you look at what his learning involves, he thinks there's an analogy between the power of the president and the power of a constitutional monarch. In fact, he thinks the constitutional monarch in England is too limited in his power. So when he faces threats in the form of newspaper editors criticizing him, he doesn't think that's protected speech, even though the First Amendment's been passed. And in fact, he signs the Sedition Act, and just to show you what it is, which is a shutdown of the opposition party, it makes it a crime to criticize the president of the United States, but it remains perfectly legal to criticize the vice president. Now, why would they do that? It's because the vice president, Thomas Jefferson, is a member of the opposition party. So it's even in its text, it's gerrymandered to shut down the opposition. And those who are targeted, including a sitting congressman of the opposition party, Matthew Lyon from Vermont, and newspaper editors who are Adams' fiercest critics. And this isn't, the criticism is about policy, and yet he doesn't want to allow it. And it's a mix of, he is thin-skinned, as I said, but it is also based in this idea that in England, the king can't be criticized. There's sedition. And they think that's consistent with the First Amendment. Now, the reason he doesn't get away with it is not that he goes to court, to continue our last conversation. In fact, Samuel Chase, a sitting Supreme Court justice, lobbies for these acts and sits on the trial of Thomas Cooper, one of the editors who's convicted on them, and refuses to even allow him to raise the issue of free speech. So it becomes politics, not through the court, that the newspaper editors use their own trials as a way of putting Adams on trial. And they use in particular the election of 1800, and they make it, this is going to sound familiar, a referendum on democracy, to say, look, it's autocracy or democracy. And they're really not exaggerating. It is true. If Adams would have won that election, there would not have been an opposition party in the way that we think of today.
It's so interesting, too, that we look back to Adams as a founding father, and there's just, we have varnished the history with this notion of founding father, as though there's a certain deification of those, the handful that were involved in the founding of the nation. And you really point up, this particular founding father had a lot of serious flaws. And then I want to skip ahead because you also talk about Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, bad guy. And I mean, I understand, presidents can be a mix of good and bad, but wow, Wilson really tried to do things with his power that really are just loathsome, I think. And you go into some detail in the book about it.
Yeah, and again, like Adams and Wilson share something in common, aside from their assault on democracy, which I'll talk about in a second, which is that they're regarded in their own time as the premier constitutional thinkers of the moment. That's certainly true of Adams, and in fact, he's still lauded by McCullough and others for that. And Wilson, professor of politics at Princeton, teacher of constitutional law and comparative constitutional law, president of Princeton, he really has all of these sort of high credentials. But yet what I did is I went into the archives in Princeton, and unbelievably, the librarian had the foresight at the time when he was elected governor to collect all the student notebooks. And so in these notebooks, you get the notes of what he was saying in class and what his general philosophy is. And what that turns out to be is, well, very disturbing. He thinks, for instance, that unlike Washington, what I described, that the president really has a unique obligation in American politics to pursue national efficiency beyond the reach and power of the other two branches. And that's not the disturbing part. The disturbing part is that he identifies one thing really as in the opposition to national efficiency, and that's what he calls friction. And what does he mean by friction? He means integration. And so he really sees the national opposition. He's not, as I say in the book, certainly not the first white supremacist president, but he is the first white nationalist president, in meaning the spread of segregation that he seeks nationally. He does that partly through the segregation of the federal government, resegregation of the federal government, through his rhetoric. Showing
speak to that, because this is like we're getting comments like this. How bad was Wilson? Example. Speak to that, the federal government thing that he actually did.
The federal government was, for instance, the post office we can take first, which is one of the most important parts of the federal government at that time. And what Wilson is really doing is not announcing it, but he certainly, and we know this is at his direction, and I'm going to tell you how we know in part in a second, demanding the segregation of these offices and firing or demoting black civil servants who had been advanced in the civil service before, with real impact on their lives. Now, that's been rediscovered recently, but at the time, the theme of the book, of course, is, in the Adams case, it's the newspaper editors who fight back and prevail upon recovery presidents, Jefferson and Madison, to put the Constitution back. In the case of Wilson, the opposition comes from, I profiled two people in particular, the newspaper editor William Monroe Trotter from Boston and Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching activist, and they go to Wilson and they call him out precisely for what I'm talking about. And we know this because Trotter was smart enough to leak the transcript of what happened in the meeting. But what's incredible about the meeting is he calls him out not just for this action. He says, look, what you're doing in this act of segregation is you're taking this regional idea of segregation and seeking to make that the philosophy of the national government. And Wilson says, I'm doing no such thing, that all I'm doing is trying to create efficiency. And if you see anything in what I'm doing, second-class citizenship, that's on you. He's really repeating the lie of Plessy versus Ferguson. And when Trotter and Wells push back, he says an amazing thing to them, given what I just told you about his lecture notes. He says, you're creating friction. He really sees even the challenge to him in the Oval Office and the challenge to the idea that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment might be inconsistent with the spread of segregation as the creation of friction. And, you know, who are these people to oppose me, these great civil rights heroes? He doesn't see them that way. And so that's, you know, one of the main examples. But I talked too about his rhetoric, how even in the midst of Red Summer, he not only during a Washington, D.C. riot refuses to call out any troops to quell the rioting. I shouldn't call it a riot. It's really a massacre of Black Americans. But he's using language that's inflammatory about, in the midst of this violence, about the disloyalty of what he calls hyphenated Americans, including Black Americans, and really suggesting that any opposition to him is disloyalty to America. So in many ways, he really reflects Trump, and in some ways he goes beyond it. Not even Trump has tried to resegregate the federal government, for instance.
The book is fascinating, and you've broken it into, you know, these five portions. Let's show the book cover again, will you, Tony? That's great. Again, it's the presidents and the people, five leaders who threatened democracy and the citizens who fought to defend it. It's interesting, and we skip ahead, and in the chat, I see a lot of this, you know, what can we do right now? And the citizens who fought to defend it, which is part of the title of your book, is no small part of what you talk about, both in our history and in our contemporary history that we're making now. I wonder if you could spend a moment on that. I mean, this is, are we limited to the vote and activism? Where are we in terms of trying to push back this rise of autocratic instincts on the part of our leaders?
Great, and thanks for that question, which really opens up the reason why I wrote the book. It's not a book just about threats to democracy, and it is a book in part about how we've recovered with the help of subsequent recovery presidents. But the mechanism in each of these recoveries, the recovery from the Sedition Act and the shutdown of the opposition party in Adams, and I'll talk too about the recovery from Buchanan and the lobbying of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case to deny all rights, legal personhood, period, to Black Americans throughout the country. The recovery from Wilson that I discussed. The way that those happen is in a really specific way in each of the themes, and it's not just elections; it's citizens reclaiming a democratic idea of the Constitution and organizing around it. so that when the recovery happens, when the threat president is defeated, autocratic presidents really are defeated, or those with that ambition, there's an agenda, an idea of what that recovery will look like. So we've been talking, for instance, about the newspaper editors who fought back against Adams. And when Jefferson is elected and he says, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, one of the most famous lines in American presidential history, he's really sending the signal, I'm going to honor this resistance to the Sedition Act. And, you know, Jefferson is far from a perfect president, not just, of course, on the issue of slavery, but he does secretly seek the prosecution of his enemies while he's publicly proclaiming to protect speech. But the Sedition Act doesn't come back. He does pardon the editors. But it's really the Madison presidency, I argue, where you see this heroic refusal to pass a new Sedition Act to shut down the opposition Federalist Party. And it's because of the ideas, not just the election of 1800, but the ideas that are bigger than any political party, that Madison sees himself as beholden to this idea of free speech, even in the midst of war. So he honors the opposition party by inviting people to the White House, including a Federalist newspaper editor named Hanson. The hero of the book are these various citizens who push back, but there's really one chief hero, and he's the one I think that we can look to for true inspiration, and that's Frederick Douglass. During the Buchanan presidency, the court is considering the possibility of deciding this case, Dred Scott, in a way that will result in a catastrophe for Black Americans throughout the country. And in the midst of it, what Buchanan does is publicly he says, I'm neutral, I trust the court. They're the interpreters of the Constitution. And privately, he lobbies for the most evil, and I use that word assuredly, it is the most evil decision in American history at the behest of Buchanan. And it did strip Black Americans of all rights, citizenship even, under the federal Constitution. Now, what do you do? And I think some citizens are going to relate to this possibility at the time right now when we think about what we can do. And that was William Lloyd Garrison said we need to scrap this Constitution altogether. This case is evil, and it reveals an evil Constitution at its base. And Douglass did something more brilliant, in my opinion, the thing that we should follow. He said, look, if you read the Constitution in the right way, not the way Buchanan or the court is reading it, you can see a devotion to democracy. We the people, it says, not we the white people. It bans the corruption of blood, the idea that you can inherit the punishments and crimes of parents. What is that, he says, but an anti-slavery principle? And most importantly, he returns to the Declaration of Independence. He says the idea of equality in the Declaration, like the preamble, is not limited and has to apply to the entire Constitution. And he uses those ideas with the backing of his constituency. Democratic constitutional constituency is the phrase I use in the book to describe this process, to put his weight between. Originally, Lincoln is far from his position. He thinks slavery is protected within the states. He thinks that the Fugitive Slave Act is wrong but has to be enforced. But with Douglass prevailing on him, there's an effort he changes his mind. By the time of Gettysburg, the idea that the war is sanctified by opposition to slavery comes from Douglass. But really, these things take time, and it's in the Grant presidency and the prosecution of more than 1,000 white terrorists around the country that we really see Douglass's ideas come to life. So the point of these stories, telling them so in depth, as I do in the book, is it's not just that we can prevail over Trump's threat to democracy. It's that we have prevailed in equally worrying times. And we've done so with a focus and an agenda that really thinks about not just policy, but recovery of fundamental constitutional themes. And that's why, when we started with the immunity case, that's not a small thing, recovering the idea that no person, even a president, is above the law. That's the thing I think we need to do going forward.
It's I'll get to this in a second, John, this question, John Watson. But what I would, okay, I'll get to that right now. I'm sorry, I see that our time is short. But I just want to make this quick aside. So much overlap with, by the way, all your writings really are so applicable to this time that we're in. Even as they look back at history, there's so much applicability to this moment in time. And so it is with the presidential immunity. You couldn't find something that is more on target. Now to the question John had in the chat. In your guest's opinion, who was the worst U.S. president? You always get this, is Trump the worst? Was right. Bush the worst because of Iraq? Was Wilson the worst because he was so prejudiced and bigoted? did, et cetera, and so on. Can you speak to,
Yeah.
give us your worst three if you want.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I would say is that I think that the best and worst discussion that you often get about presidents, I'm trying to do something that's a little different, which is to reframe it and to talk about criteria, and the criteria in particular of the oath of office, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And then I'm getting even a little complicated in saying it's not any Constitution, it's a democratic idea of we the people. And so that's really the way that I want to measure whether presidents have done the job or not. It's not about whether they were good or bad people. It's about whether or not they protected or threatened democracy. And so, take Adams, for instance, who is seen in many ways, for good reason, as a nice person. He wasn't a criminal. But, from the lens that I'm offering, he almost destroyed the very possibility of multi-party democracy. So, I think that's what I'm really doing, is getting us to reshape these questions around the idea of defenses of not just the oath, but the democratic understanding of the Constitution.
Yeah, it's interesting, too. We have a recency bias, don't you think, John Rothman? We always just kind of think that the guy we're living through right now is the worst, and yet that's why I think your book's so great. Thank you. There's a look back at some of this other stuff that led us to this point in history. Rothman, I'm going to excuse the witness if you have anything in closing.
No, I'm going to order the book right away, Corey. I'm very impressed, and 3 cheers for what you've done.
Thanks so much. Great to meet you.
The presidents and the people, 5 leaders who threatened democracy and the citizens who fought to defend it. By the way, that Frederick Douglass isn't on the $20 bill instead of Andrew effing Jackson is an absolute grotesque crime. It is unbelievable that despicable president, Andrew Jackson, who slaughtered, he has all that blood on his hands of Native Americans, that he's on the $20 bill and not Frederick Douglass, this great American. I mean, arguably the greatest American.
Yeah, as I've been doing various media, and I say something like this in the book, but I've been saying the true founder of American democracy is Frederick Douglass. Now, you might think, well, he didn't live in the 18th century at the time the Constitution's written, but the reason I think of him as the true founder of American democracy is he is clearly the first and clearest in teaching us how to read that document. And the fact that he doesn't want to jettison it doesn't mean that he reads it the way that the pro-slavery forces might have in the 18th century, for instance, from South Carolina. And so that idea of we the people as a principle, that's what he teaches us. And so, if I had to choose one founder of American democracy, he's it.
Bravo, bravo. Corey,
you should point out, if I can, that Douglass attended Lincoln's inauguration, and Lincoln valued what he said.
Yeah, well, in the book, as you'll see, John, because I know it's coming in the next 24 hours, I talk in depth about how it's not just that these were ideas, that Douglass sat there with Lincoln twice and prevailed on him to adopt his idea of the Constitution. And he used stories, including the fact that his 2 sons were fighting in the Union Army, to talk about the issue of equal pay, and then to broaden it, to say, really, you have to think of the Constitution not as a legalistic document, but as a moral one. And so when Lincoln gives his famous speech at Gettysburg, government, by, for, and of the people, that in many ways it's him, of course, but he's channeling the ideas, I think, that Douglass has brought him around to.
There's a lot of Frederick Douglass in your book, and I think that speaks so well for the book itself. So there'll be a link to buy the book under this video and under this live podcast as well. The Presidents and the People, 5 leaders who threatened democracy and the citizens who fought to defend it. Corey Brettschneider, don't wait. We want you in between books also. So please come visit again, man. Always love seeing you and talking with you.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
Love the
Thanks,
conversation.
guys.
Thanks so much, and thanks for reading it.
Yeah, good stuff. Corey Brettschneider. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.